Greetings all. Nice to be with you once again. We are finally continuing our Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra series. So we paused for a few weeks. I was traveling. I was in Bali and Australia, and now we are at last continuing. And part of the reason for the delay is that the verses that we've now arrived at are more complex, and they have quite a bit of Sanskrit commentary that I had to look through to make sure I wasn't missing anything. So what you guys have access to, what the public has access to, of course, is just the root text, the verses, but there are also Sanskrit commentaries that have never been translated, although in the Jaidev Singh version of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra, he does commonly or frequently quote the commentaries, but very far from being a full translation. So I'm going to take you through these verses, even though, really speaking, you can't practice the technique taught here, the yukti that's taught here, unless you have a very detailed knowledge of the tradition already. But still, this is a good opportunity to take you through these key concepts of the view, even though I imagine that almost none of you, or even none of you, will be able to do the technique here, again, unless you've studied in the tradition and its ontology in great detail. So let's just dive into the verses and see what they actually say, and then you'll see what I'm talking about. Okay, verse 56, I'm pasting it into your chat window for those of you who are watching live. I realize most of you don't watch live. And now, by the way, we are firmly into the second third of the text. So we're a little over 1/3 of the way through the text. So verse 56, introducing the 29th yukti in my numbering, which disagrees with everybody else's numbering, so you don't need to worry about that. You can chant along if you like. Bhuvanādhvādi-rūpeṇa cintayet kramaśo khilam sthūla-sūkṣma-para-sthityā yāvad ante mano-layaḥ. One may contemplate the whole of reality in terms of the path of worlds and or any of the other paths. Through stabilizing this contemplation in due order, from coarse to subtle to supreme, in the end, the mind dissolves into the absolute. So I'll go through again just word by word, so you can see what the Sanskrit words that correspond. I know, a few of you are learning Sanskrit. And by the way, we're getting my, or rather a volunteer, Rachel, is organizing my Sanskrit Facebook group. So once that's organized, those of you who want to learn basic Sanskrit can join, and it'll be possible to learn there. Anyway, so one may contemplate, cintayet, the whole of reality, khilam, akilam, the a has dropped by sandhi, in terms of the path of worlds or any of the other paths, bhuvanādhvādi-rūpeṇa. Through stabilizing sthitya, this contemplation, in due order, kramaśo, from coarse to subtle to supreme, sthūla-sūkṣma-para. In the end, yāvad ante, the mind dissolves into the absolute, mano-layaḥ. Okay, so what is this talking about? Well, this is covered in Tantra Illuminated, this teaching on the 6 paths or the 6 courses of reality, the shad adhvaṃ. So here, I'll type that word. Adhvaṃ means course or path. Now, in the Shakta Shaiva description of the universe, right? The description of the universe in the Shiva Shakti traditions. We find this map, this sixfold map. But what's important to understand is that each of the six paths actually maps the whole universe, but maps it from different perspectives. Okay, so this will be much clearer for those of you who already read this section of Tantra Illuminated. But okay, I'll start with these three: kala, tattva, and bhuvana. So the kalas are the five major kind of divisions of reality into the five aspects of divine creative power, from nivritti to shantya-atita. I can't get into that now, it's way too detailed. But this is a unique teaching, in Shaiva ontology. And then we have the tattva map, the 36 tattvas, or 37 if you include tattva number 0. And again, that's also a complete map. So the 5 kalas and the 36 tattvas, each is a complete map of the universe. Different ways of slicing the same cake. Physicists say loaf. I say cake. It's a giant cake. You can slice it different ways. It's like a marbled cake. When you slice it different ways, you get different patterns. Okay. So the third then is the bhuvana map. That is the 118 dimensions of reality that are enumerated in the tantras, in the scriptures. So that's another complete map in terms of dimensions, okay? So, yeah. So this earth plane, the reality we experience in, 3 spatial dimensions, 1 time dimension, that's just one way of experiencing reality. And there's 117 other ways that reality is experienced by different types of beings. Right, so there are those people who have these, sort of vague memories or impressions of having lived in other dimensions, on astral realms and planes and stuff. And the tradition totally believes in that, these 118 dimensions. Okay, so those 3 that I just mentioned, kala, tattva, bhuvana, those 3 maps of reality are on the they're on what's called the vācya side, meaning to say signifieds. They are maps of the various aspects of reality that are pointed to or expressed by words. So they're the maps of the thingness of reality. And then on the other side, we have the maps of the signifiers, that is to say, the structures of consciousness through which consciousness represents its experience of reality to itself. So for those of you who are familiar with the field of semiotics, this terminology is there, but it's also there very much so in the tantric tradition. Signifiers and signifieds. Signifiers are linguistic structures that represent the way in which consciousness represents its experience to itself. Okay, and those consist of, that side is varna, mantra, and pada. Okay, varna means phoneme, a syllable, basically, but phoneme stresses the fact that these are sonic vibrations, not letters. They're not written letters. These are sonic vibrations that are the building blocks of language. So those are called varnas or phonemes. Then mantras, which are made up of varnas, right, are another level of linguistic representation. And then pada, those are phrases or mantra units or sentences. That's another level of linguistic representation, right? And what the tradition is stressing is that language is a miracle. What is language? It is, again, the process by which consciousness represents its experience to itself. And language has inherent structure. We now know, due to the work of Steven Pinker and others, that the brain, our human brain, is actually hardwired for language. We are born with brains ready to receive language. And language has inherent structure. There are key commonalities among all the world's languages, even though they can be very, very, very diverse. There are key grammatical, structural consistencies across all human language, right? That is to say, from the tantric point of view, it would be put this way. There is structure to the way consciousness represents itself to itself. It's not random. That there are patterns within consciousness that then give rise to the patterns within language. So consciousness is not amorphous, blank slate. It has inherent, very, 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 very subtle structure, by virtue of which our languages are structured, by virtue of which we can translate from one language into another. Even though translation is always imperfect, still we can do it. There isn't any language that's just untranslatable. Okay, so again, there are 6 paths or courses that map reality. 3 on the side of the vachikas, signifiers, and those are, again, varna, mantra, pada. And then 3 on the side of vachikas, signifieds, the things that language is representing. And those, again, are kala, the 5 aspects of creative power, tattva, the 37 principles of reality, and bhuvana, the 118 dimensions. Okay? So what is the author of the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra inviting us to do here? Well, this verse proves that this is a tantra proper, meaning to say it's an initiatory text. Nobody would be able to understand what this verse is talking about without being an initiate into, this realm of tantric practice, which includes this fairly detailed teaching on the mapping of the nature of reality in these 6 ways. So there's no way that this text was meant to be like picked up by anyone at the local bookshop and away you go. It needs to be explained by a teacher. There's no other way you could understand the text. And the only reason a teacher, such as myself and others who have expounded on this text, such as Mark Deshkovsky and Jaidev Singh and others, that the reason we can expound the text is only because we've read dozens of other sources that talk about these concepts that are only alluded to here in this text. So there's no way to interpret any one text in Tantra without intertextuality, without a detailed exploration of all the sources that are relevant to the one source you're reading. So this is key that you understand. No matter how good your Sanskrit is, you can never understand one text without reference to parallel passages in other texts. That's what makes this job challenging. That's why it takes years and years and years to be competent, let alone proficient in this field. It's just, you have to be widely read. You have to understand intertextuality, or it's just not going to make sense, Okay, so what is the verse actually inviting you to do? Assuming you know one of these maps, okay? Now, some of you do know one of these maps, that is to say, the 36 tattva map. Of all the 6 maps here, that's the one you're most likely to know. So let's say you know the 36 tattva map. What do? Well, the practice here is to meditate on each tattva one at a time, starting with earth and ending with formless Shiva. That is a very time-consuming thing, because to really fully grok each tattva, you need to meditate on it for weeks or months. So to go through all 37 or 36 tattvas, that's going to take a while. But Jaidev Singh suggests, basing himself on Śaiva Upadhyāya's commentary, that there's another way to do this, that you could actually dissolve each advan, each path or map, into the more subtle one, and then into the more subtle one than that. I'm not really sure that this is actually what the text intends. It seems dubious to me. It seems to me that the text is intending that we pick one of these maps and work through it. So, for most people who know the tradition, the obvious choice would be the kala map, because it's only 5. There's only 5 elements that you're going to meditate on. That's a lot fewer than, 36 elements. But if most people don't really understand the kalas, so then the tattvas becomes another choice. But anyway, what are you doing? Because the text says step by step, you should go from gross to or coarse or tangible to more subtle, sūkṣma, to supreme. So this is why Jaidev Singh was interpreting. You got to take each advan and dissolve it into the more subtle one, like dissolve the bhuvanādhvādi-rūpeṇa as a whole. I'm not sure how you would do that, but dissolve the bhuvanādhvādi into the tattva advan as a whole, dissolve that into the kala advan as a whole, dissolve that into the absolute. Again, I'm dubious about that's what's intended, because it's also the case that each of these maps gets more and more and more subtle as you ascend. So if you were just doing the tattva map, for example, you're starting in the sthula level. You're starting in the coarse elements, the tangible elements, earth, water, fire, wind. They're very tangible, right? And then you're going to subtler and subtler and subtler and subtler until you get to the supreme level, which would be the highest tattvas, Maya itself, and then Shuddha Vidya, and then Sadashiva, then Ishvara, Sadashiva, Shakti, and Shiva. In the end, the mind dissolves, mano-layaḥ. What is that telling us? That this is a laya yoga practice, L-Y-A, no, L-A-Y-A, laya yoga practice, meaning you're dissolving one element into the next, going to subtler and subtler and subtler levels until you reach the absolute transcendent, okay? Now, I argue that the next verse, verse 57, I wrote it wrong in the title of the video. Verse 57 is just talking about the same practice. Now, if you look at Jaidev Singh translation, he has to really work hard to try to make verse 57, the following verse, be a different yukti or dharana. And his attempt is wholly unconvincing, I think. If you read it yourself, you'll see what I mean. He's trying to make it into another practice because he's inherited this idea that every verse has to be a different practice. So by simply dropping that dogma, we see a different reality here, which is that the two verses are actually talking about the same practice, that the one and the same practice gets 2 verses. So see if you agree. We're coming to verse 57 now, the second verse on this same practice, I argue. See if you agree. Asya sarvasya viśvasya paryanteṣu samantataḥ adhva-prakriyayā tattvaṃ śaivaṃ dhyātvā mahodayaḥ. Through meditating on the adhva-prakriyā, up to the limits of this entire universe, and then on the Śaiva Tattva, there comes the great dawn of liberation. Okay, so adhva-prakriyā means, prakriyā is like a system or a method. So it's the adhva system, right? We often see the phrase tantra prakriyā, meaning the tantric method. Thoroughly meditating on the adhva system Again, does this mean you pick one of the advans, one of the six, and go through it thoroughly? Or does it mean you're meditating on all six somehow, as Jaidev Singh believes? Again, the verses themselves are unclear. But anyway, thoroughly meditating on the adhva system, either one or all six, up to the limits of this entire universe, right? Then on the Śaiva Tattva. So what does that mean? Well, there's two ways to interpret Śaiva Tattva. Śaiva means pertaining to Shiva, and Tattva means principle or level of reality. So it could mean just the final Tattva in the Tattva map of Śaiva Tattva, formless transcendent Shiva. But why not just say Śaiva Tattva then? Why say Śaiva Tattva? Well, Śaiva means, and even back then meant, the whole kind of spiritual universe of teachings related to Shiva and Shakti, right? So sometimes you'll hear me say, as I did earlier in the video, Shakta Śaiva. That's just making explicit something that's already actually implicit in the term Śaiva. So this is, non-dual Śaiva Tantra is non-dual Shiva Shakti Tantra. But sometimes people don't realize that they're taking Śaiva in the narrower sense as pertaining to Shiva. And so sometimes I'll say Shakta Śaiva, and other teachers will use that terminology too. But actually, all the scholars follow the primary sources in using Śaiva to mean everything, the whole universe of Shiva Shakti teachings. So Śaiva Tattva then could mean Tattva number 0 or Tattva number 37, depending on which numbering system you're following, which is Shiva Shakti Samarasya, Shiva Shakti in perfect fusion, Shiva Shakti as one, right? As opposed to just Shiva. And so that would be the ultimate principle of reality, that which is not even capturable in a hierarchy or in a chart. So after going through all 36 tattvas, or 118 bhuvanas, or 5 kalas, then everything dissolves into the absolute, which is dynamic consciousness. One way of defining Shiva Shakti is dynamic consciousness, as opposed to the static consciousness taught by Vedanta and some other paths. Here we have a teaching that consciousness is inherently dynamic. Shiva is never without Shakti. And the image of Shiva and Shakti as a conjugal pair making love is a metaphorical anthropomorphic image meant to depict this. Among other things, it depicts that consciousness is inherently dynamic. It is not static and eternally still. It has a still aspect, that's the Shiva aspect, but it also has an aspect called dynamism, Shakti, vibration, expansion and contraction, an aspect that eternally dances, as well as an aspect that's eternally still. But these are two aspects of one universal consciousness. So that, I would argue, is the Śaiva Tattva here. So anyway, you can see that these two verses together, are pointing to a practice that most modern practitioners are not going to be familiar with. But what I will do is I'll do a post in the Facebook group. Oh gosh, sorry, my glasses are so reflective, by the way. I just noticed that. So that must be distracting. I need to get what do you call that? Non-reflective glasses for these videos. So I'll do a post in the Facebook group saying, laying these out a little bit more, pointing you to the relevant pages in Tantra Illuminated, just for the people. Some of you I know are completists, meaning to say you like to feel like you've understood each and every verse. And I'm like that too. So for you completists, we'll do a post on this topic of these 6 advans, and then we'll move on because remember, it's not the case, actually, from a spiritual point of view, it's not the case that you need to understand each and every verse at all, because the text itself says, or will say later on, if you could thoroughly master even one practice from the most of us need some variety in our practice. Most of us need more than one practice. But theoretically speaking, even just one practice is enough according to the text, the scripture itself. So remember, it doesn't matter if you don't get a verse or a couple verses. We just move on. And you work with the verses that you do get. And now with the next video, and I'll start doing more videos now so we can sort of get caught up to where we're supposed to be, even though that's just a mental construct. I had promised to do one a week, so that's getting caught up. Next section is another section on shunya or shunyata, spaciousness. We already had a whole section on spaciousness. We get more spaciousness before we go into the bliss practices. So we get half a dozen verses on spaciousness practice next, shunya, and then the ananda practices, the juicy, blissful, pleasurable practices, including the notorious or infamous teaching on cultivating sexual energy in the Vijñāna-bhairava-tantra. So for those of you who are excited to find out about the ananda yuktis, the bliss practices, they're coming. We're just half a dozen verses away now. Any comments, any questions? Let's see. Alicia says, do the three paths on each side dissolve into each other? No. You mean bhuvana dissolving into pada and tattva dissolving into mantra? No, they dissolve upward into the more subtle versions, into the more subtle advans, if that makes sense. Yeah, so just to clarify, kind of what Alicia is referring to here is that these are maps of creation and of liberation. That's always the case. This is a key principle in Tantra, that a map of creation is always a ladder to liberation as well. So when you're coming sort of top down from most subtle to least subtle, that's called the srishti krama, or the direction of creation, the sequence of creation. And if you're going from bottom up, from least subtle to most subtle, that is the samhara krama, the sequence of reabsorption or involution, returning to source. So every map of creation in Tantra is also a ladder to liberation. So yes, varna to mantra to pada, and then also kala to tattva to bhuvana. But then remember, each of those breaks down into into its own map. So from the tattva map, it's the same thing. From Shiva down to earth, that is the srishti krama, the direction of creation. From earth up to Shiva, or rather Shiva Shakti, that is the samhara krama, the direction of reabsorption or liberation. So no, that's not a tangent at all, Alicia. That's exactly the point. So yeah, I'll map it. I'll put it in the post. You don't have to, it's easier when you see it laid out visually. Okay. And then back here, Angela had said, because I said there's no language that's untranslatable to any other. And Angela said the Indus Valley language or symbols is untranslatable. Absolutely, but that's not a language. That's a script that probably represents a language, right? So the problem there is that we don't know what language that script corresponds to. So that's a completely different problem. So when we're talking about language, we're talking about something. It's not something written. Written is after the fact. Written is a possibility for any language, but a language exists without writing. A language is therefore a structure of consciousness. And any language can be translated to any other language, though always with some degree of imperfection. So Henry asks, is there a PDF on this? That's what I'm about to make. But also, look at Tantra Illuminated. I don't have the page number handy. It's towards the end of the first, it's very, very close to the end of the philosophy section of Tantra Illuminated. So 1/3 of the way through the text. Okay. Andra says, I like reabsorption better than liberation as a concept. Yes, but they are one and the same. They're just two words for the same thing. Sort of, because reabsorption doesn't necessarily imply embodied liberation. And so that's something we get in the Kaula teachings that we'll address another time. Om. Nice to be with you. And again, if you're trying the practice of every single verse and you really want to do this practice, you could just meditate on earth tattva, then water, and so on, all the way up to 36 tattvas. You could do one per day. It's not going to actually produce the effect of irrevocable liberation, right? Because you're supposed to master each tattva as you go. But just as a fun exercise, you could meditate on one tattva per day for 36 days if you wanted. See what happens. It can be a fun exercise. But you have to understand the tattvas very well to do that. Otherwise, you can just move on and we'll get another practice that we can actually do in the following verse, which I'll probably make a video for tomorrow or the next day. Om. Finally, we're continuing with our VBT course. It's exciting to move on and to get into some more juicy stuff with you guys. You'll be amazed if you haven't read the whole text yet. You'll be amazed at the variety of this text. It's much more diverse even than what we've seen so far. Lastly, Brian asks, how helpful is Andre Padu's Vach? Very helpful. Yes, reliable. Yeah, I mean, it doesn't detail all 6 advans, but it's it gets into this stuff in some detail. Yeah. Okay. See you next time. Om.